Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate you making it over after the food coma-inducing lunch. So we are going to be talking about integrating with the network. I'm joined by two of our software engineers. We've got Joel and Michael, and then myself. You can see who's the remote person by the person who doesn't have the official HR-looking photo. I figured snow made for a good white background. So we're going to go through what I hope will give you a little bit of insight into network integration. And the first question that you probably want to be asking yourself is, should I be here? It's a great question to ask, so trying to answer that right up front. Just ask the following questions to yourself and see if you come up with a yes, and if you don't, you can run. But if your customer base is growing, you're probably in a good session. If you're considering offering global services, probably also in a good session. And if you want a little bit more context around some of the newer components that have been introduced in Jamf Pro, then you are in a great place. That said, maybe you're still not sure. A lot of times in pro services, we sort of start to hear the same types of questions. What else can I do in my JSS? What else can I be doing with my JSS? What else should I be doing to my JSS? So if any of those have come up for you, you're probably in the right spot. High-level integration details around, again, those new components I mentioned, Cisco Identity Services Engine, potentially around the Jamf Infrastructure Manager, both for the LDAP proxy and the healthcare listener, those sorts of things. If you just want to get an idea of how various components fit together and how we think of advising customers, then you're in a good spot. And so with that, you may find yourself asking, well, how are we going to manage to pull all that off? How are we going to get from where we are right now to hopefully in less than an hour, you having a better feeling about some of those topics? First and foremost, we'll start with some architecture examples, basically walking our way through a couple of fake customers to try and give you an idea for the things we're looking for. We'll talk a bit about distribution points. Then I'll hand over to Joel. We'll go through and talk about MySQL, Jamf Infrastructure Manager, and Cisco ISE, some of those newer components towards the bottom there. So without further ado, again, our trip to Storyville. We'll go through a number of setups here. The point of these, though, is not for me to necessarily say, if you look like this, you should do X. It's more just to illustrate some concepts, internal versus external device management, load balancing and clustering, how they work together but are not necessarily the same thing. And then we'll recap with some general themes. So without further ado, we hear this an awful lot. This is where a lot of our customers start, sort of a smaller implementation, certainly 200 devices in that right-hand side top column. I'm sorry for the gray on gray. But that tends to be where a lot of our customers start. It's a little bit of a smaller deployment. And if you sort of walk your way down this left-hand column, you start to see the things that we're listening for as we hear the customers talking to us about what they're concerned with. So we hear concerns about where can I manage that device? We hear concerns about how many web apps will I need? How many hosts do I need to put these various services on? We walk through MySQL. Many times folks that are just starting out have never managed a database, so that tends to come up. What is it? Why is it? Where do I put it? And then for these folks, if they're managing iOS, they might not have a need for distribution points, but they might have a need for directory integration. And so as I look down that, what I start to see here is, many services on a single box. And who doesn't love a single point of failure? But nonetheless, for purposes of budget, maybe just because it's a pilot and we don't want to allocate a bunch of resources to something that hasn't been tested yet, this is where we see a lot of folks start out. That single JSS web app, a single database instance, all of it running on the same box, and then potentially us talking out to directory services. So if you run through ports on that one, directory services probably not using SSL necessarily since we're still inside the network. We might just be talking out to that database. Again, it's local, so it's just going to be on 3306 for the port for the directory, for MySQL rather, and then for the directory on, 389 for that. And then our JSS web apps, management access and client access, both on 8443. The server's got to be able to talk out to Apple. So we're looking at port 2195 and 2196 for that. And our clients out on the network on 5223. Now, all of it's not on the slide because all of it's documented in knowledge base articles, and your TAM can help with any of that stuff. But the point is that there's not a lot of gear here, and we're really only talking to internally maybe one additional piece of infrastructure. And then within a handful of months, we start to hear things like this. we'd like to manage globally. We want to go outside the firewall. We want to be able to take care of devices when I travel over to England and I'm potentially going out on jump starts in Portugal or whatever it might be. I'd like to make sure that I still have a hand on that device. And if that's the case, you can start to see some of the changes. For the web apps, maybe now we've got two, one internally and one externally. So that's probably going to mean now two hosts, one that lives inside the firewall and one that's in the DMZ. Then we've also got now MySQL. Why not? If we're starting to plan for growth, let's break that out onto its own box. Once we've got MySQL on its own box, again, still staying away from a distribution point for now, not a lot of need for us to have that yet. But the big thing is the directory service now. We're hopefully going to get that set up via SSL, so now we've got a little bit more security because we do have that one web app that's out in the DMZ, and we've also got that web app internally. It's the one in the DMZ that we want to be concerned with. So we'll try and make sure that we've got firewall rules. We'll make sure that external DMZ web app can talk back into directory services. We'll make sure it can talk back into the database, and we'll go ahead and we'll make sure that we've got something called split DNS or split horizon DNS. You'll hear it referred to multiple ways. This is just a fancy way of saying, if you're talking to our internal DNS, I'm going to send you to the internal web app. If you're talking to external DNS, I'll send you to the DMZ web app. So very straightforward concepts here. The one thing that you should be thinking about then is, well, so do I have to fidget with anything to get those web apps to work together? The answer is yes, and that's called clustering, and we'll talk about it more in a little bit. So potentially, they move along this imaginary company, and now they start managing iOS, more clients there, and Mac OS, almost slipped. And as they go through now, we might be recommending instead that instead of having just an internal and an external, maybe we want them to be load balanced. Because they're managing Mac OS now, we're probably a little more concerned with distribution points. We want to make things available to them for third-party software installs. We want to make sure potentially that they're able to get those packages internally as well as externally. And so we might go ahead and set up an SMB share internally and front it with IIS. We might actually go ahead and use maybe a cloud integration. That could be Amazon, Rackspace, Akamai. If you're a Jamf Cloud customer, you might be using the JCDS. But all of this really just amounts to, hey, we're serving more clients. Let's go ahead and give a little more oomph to our web apps so that we can split that load. And we'll talk a little bit about what load balancing is in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, it's a little more complex. You're now dealing with multiple hosts for the internal web apps. Potentially, as we go to the next slide, with even more iOS and even more Mac OS, now we're dealing with load balanced and multiple web apps internally and externally. Maybe our InfoSec and our infrastructure folks have gotten to us now and have started to say, hey, you know, this one MySQL database, it's great, but we'd really like to see you set up replication. And replication is nothing more than having your primary MySQL host and a secondary one, and we just replicate the data over from one to the other. Now, just a quick note about that replication. Don't consider it a backup. Anything that goes wrong here will very quickly be replicated over to your secondary. This is more for a host failure, for a networking failure, for something that doesn't involve the consistency of the data. So this is not a substitute for backups. This is more just a way to mitigate maybe infrastructure issues of one kind or another. So as we go down the list there, we're still managing globally. Now we've got load balancing internally and externally, more than likely as well. We've got dual MySQL databases. Notice the plus. When we start to see client counts up in the tens of thousands, that's when we start to see folks looking to potentially diversify their data center setup. So they may not have one database on multiple hosts in a data center. They may have that on multiple hosts in multiple data centers. And it's just, again, for that catastrophic failure for earthquakes, floods, those sorts of things. And as you go down the way again, multiple internal distribution points. We start to see this as organizations go into more geographically diverse locations because they might be bandwidth constrained. So as you get out into those places that are bandwidth constrained, it doesn't necessarily make an awful lot of sense to be pointing them at Amazon for everything. Now every single package download is going out and using that outbound link. So we might use a combination. Some internal distribution points in one location. Our folks that are working from home might be using a cloud distribution point. We might even have additional internal distribution points at our key corporate locations or campus locations. But all of that is being done very intentionally to respond to a need. Now as we go through, You might say, well, what about the cloud? Sure, what about the cloud? It's basically all the same stuff, but if you're using Jamf Cloud, then you're having us take care of things like server maintenance, upgrades, and whatnot. If you're doing all of this on your own, let's say in Amazon's cloud or something like that, it's basically the same circus in a different tent. You can set up the same infrastructure out in Amazon that you could be setting up on your own gear. All of these things, though, are just to answer a need. If you don't have expertise in running a data center, then potentially you want to use some third-party service. Potentially you want someone else to run that third-party service. Ideally, though, the thing you should be thinking is, well, what's the trend? And the trend is moving from multiple services on a single host and eventually maturing to single services spread across multiple hosts. Again, you start to see that trend towards specialization as folks bring on board more managed endpoints, as they potentially have requirements placed on them because they're becoming more visible inside their organization. So the big question, how do you turn this into something that looks a little bit more like this? And the answer really, when you look at it, is you just address the individual components. Just work your way through that list and address each component in turn. That prior slide, and I'm just going to hop back to it for just a second, it's just multiple copies of the same sort of thing. So you just have, again, those single services spread across those multiple hosts. So as you start to go through and try and figure out, well, do we want to go externally and internally with our management? Well, then we'll need to address that with our web app management and access. Do we need to, let's say, image, for instance? Well, if we need to image, we're going to need file share distribution points because HTTP doesn't support that. So you start to work your way down through the list, and some of these things will be to affect a more positive environment for your users. Some of it, though, is going to be because you're trying to answer up into internal demands within the organization. So, just to take the web apps and the distribution points side of it, remember, any time that you're interacting with the admin interface, anytime your users are opening up self-service, anytime a policy is running, that's being handled for you by the web app. So the more of that happens, the more load you're potentially placing on that web app. And what we tend to see for a lot of our customers is that their success and their, as measured, let's say, by their number of enrolled clients, starts to take them by surprise, and they start to find that they are maybe a little bit less well-resourced than they'd like to be. And so as a result, we start talking to them about things like clustering and about things like load balancing. Clustering is pretty straightforward when it comes right down to it. It's a pretty easy option to enable in the JSS. There's only, I believe, just one or two settings to fiddle with once you have enabled it, and one of them is just the sync time. How long will each web app wait to find out if there's new information that that web app itself didn't create? So if Joel creates a smart group and I'm also in the admin interface, but I'm working from home, maybe I'm looking at a different web app than he is, that sync time is just going to regulate how long it takes for his smart group to show up for me in my interface. So when you look at clustering, it really is no more, no less than just saying, I'd like more than one web app to be able to talk into the database. As you take a look at that example, the primary driver for this, to have that clustering set up in a clustered but not load balanced setup, was because we wanted to have internal and external access. So that's one of the easiest places where you can see that setting up clustering makes a lot of sense. If we need to have one web host internally and one externally in the DMZ, they both do need to talk into that same database, and clustering is how we do that. Now, that said, clustering is like adding more lanes to the highway. You're just adding more ways to get to the same place, but load balancing is more about being a traffic cop. And so load balancing is more concerned with, great, I have 5 web apps, how do I make sure that clients are dispersed amongst them? So for the example that we had used earlier, you've got folks that are potentially dealing with a handful, 3,000 maybe clients or so, and they're starting to think, well, we'd like it to be a little speedier. We'd like to have better performance and self-service. We'd like to make sure that folks don't ever get resource not available or some sort of message like that. And so the goal here is just to make sure that we can take and have those multiple web apps have traffic assigned to them dynamically. And when it comes to load balancing, it tends to be a little bit of a mystery box to most of us. Reason being that the load balancing folks, the folks that control that infrastructure, can be less, oriented towards sharing information. A lot of times what you'll find is that they want to know exactly what you want set up, and if you knew what you wanted set up, you probably would have told them. So the terms that you tend to hear are where do you want your SSL traffic terminated? So you can have that traffic, the SSL, the encrypted traffic, stop at the load balancer. In order to do that, you're more than likely going to need to provide a certificate to your infrastructure team for them to load on that load balancer. So expect that to be the next question. If you say, yes, I would love that, and why would you? Well, because it makes the performance a little bit better on your web apps. Then expect the next thing for them to say is, hey, can you send me over your certificate chain? I'll need to load that on. The next thing that you'll probably hear from them is, what sort of load balancing scheme do you want? Sounds like a caper, but the gist of the scheme is nothing more than, do you want traffic to simply go sort of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, whoever the next client is. If I just sent traffic to 3, send the next one to 1, and so on. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 makes for a great waltz, doesn't make for the best usage of your infrastructure, because who's to say that 1 and 2 aren't right now getting absolutely obliterated with traffic, and 3 is sitting basically doing nothing. So for that reason, we a lot of times recommend least connect, as opposed to that round robin 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The last thing that you'll hear pretty often is, do we need any persistence settings? And this is really nothing more than just saying, hey, if I start communicating with webapp 1 and I want to click and load a configuration profile page, is it acceptable for me to just immediately start talking to webapp 2? And the answer is no. webapp 2 has never seen you. You have not authenticated to webapp 2. You are starting your conversation with webapp 1. So you do want to have session persistence, where you will start continue and end your communication with a single web app. Out beyond that, from session to session, we really don't care. We do see some folks prefer to have, like, say, an admin-only web app, and that's the one that they talk to quite a bit. And you can fiddle around in your host file and make sure that when you load a particular URL, it's always sending you to a specific IP. But that's a little bit more of an edge case. It's not the kind of thing that your customers are going to want to have to fiddle with or even worry about. And that's what load balancing is looking to do for you, is just send those requests to the right resource at the right time. So distribution points, we're going to go through and do a speed round there. So no better vehicle to use as an example than the 1991 Volkswagen Vanagon, known for its speed. It's not really, it's known for catching on fire. The distribution points speed round here, we're just going to run through the handful of distribution point types that we see most commonly used. You'll notice an omission. The JDS is not on the list. Notice that I said commonly used. We know that most of you are not commonly making use of the JDS for any number of reasons. We also know that the JDS is not necessarily as far along as we might like. One day we hope to make the JDS and the JCDS your default choice for distribution points. So please provide us that feedback, help us make it better, but for right now we're sticking essentially to the ones that we see folks commonly using. Those file share distribution points right up top, AFP and SMB, usually internal only. I don't think that I would ever recommend that anyone serve any of those externally. You could front those with HTTP if you chose to. This is nothing more than sharing the same directory with IIS or web services on your platform of choice. You could use those cloud distribution points, as I mentioned. And again, the primary differentiator here between file share, even when fronted by HTTP, versus just a plain old cloud service, you can't image the traditional, block level copy, bare metal restore imaging with a cloud distribution point. So there's sometimes, for those of you who are still doing that traditional imaging, when you have to maybe bulk wipe and restore a bunch of boxes at once, the file share still has a place in your infrastructure. And as we mentioned, regular third-party cloud or Jamf cloud, sort of synonymous here in terms of the benefits they provide your users, globally available, et cetera. The one nice thing about Jamf Cloud is if you are a Jamf Cloud customer, it's basically, I think, 2 clicks to set up a Jamf Cloud distribution point. So pretty straightforward from a setup perspective. And then ideally here, combo, I throw that in there again because you might have bandwidth constraints. You might be doing that bare metal imaging. You might be trying to serve only certain packages to certain areas. And that actually brings me to sync methods. First and foremost, Casper admin. And normally I pause for the groan, but Casper admin, it's baked into the product for you to be able to sync that way. That said, if you are making use of those file share distribution points, rsync, robocopy, any other third-party product that's capable of mounting and syncing a share is fair game. There are also quite a few apps out there that are capable of replicating Amazon files as well for you, so certainly some options there. The primary thing, though, that I would call out, and it plays back into that combo section from earlier, is just the idea that when you are looking to sync from a primary or a master distribution point internally that might be, say, AFP or SMB, when you sync from that to a cloud distribution point, one of the benefits that you get is selective sync. So you can go through and actually only enable certain packages to be synced out to those cloud distribution points. So I'm kind of looking in the direction of a 12 gig Adobe Creative Cloud installer when I think about that. If you have no intention of letting folks install that when they're out on the road, there's no reason to take the time, the 4, 5, 6 hours to sync it from internal out to the cloud. So that walks us through, and like I said, the goal here is for you to have a good idea of what are the types of tools that you'll have available to you, and what are the reasons that you might choose one tool over another. Ideally, you're not necessarily wanting to jump right into load balance, clustered, replicated MySQL databases, multiple distribution points, internal and external, and cloud all at once. I know some of you probably have been told that that's what will be required of you. I definitely recommend the crawl, walk, run methodology here. If you can start with a smaller infrastructure, completely understand it from start to finish, and then start to address those components one at a time, it just tends to keep you from getting overwhelmed with, it feels like I'm making a bunch of changes and I have no idea why. So that's the goal here, is to keep you making those changes that are related to specific functionality and related to adding capacity, or maybe adding services or the ability to serve those customers in different locations. So that we're going to hop over and start talking about MySQL and Cisco ISE and the Jamf Infrastructure Manager, and I'll bring up Joel.
All right, thanks, Matt. So we'll dig in with MySQL first. Just a few things Matt's already covered, but kind of dig into a little more detail on a couple items here. Just basic recommendations. You guys are probably already aware of these. We recommend Enterprise over Community Edition. That really only has to do with the fact of the support and licensing differences between the two. And currently, we recommend MySQL 5.6. 5.5 is the minimum. 5.7, as a recommendation, will be coming shortly. There were some default changes in MySQL 5.7, specifically how they handle group bys that bit us. So we had to go back in and refactor some of our queries that do group bys. But again, MySQL 5.7 support, as recommended, will be coming shortly. Matt really kind of touched on it, the fact that if you have one web app, one node JSS running MySQL on there, smaller environment, typically you're going to be perfectly fine. Once you move to a Clustered JSS environment, multiple web apps, get that MySQL instance out on its own so it can do its thing unhindered. Going into a little more detail on MySQL, if you're looking for more fault tolerance, we recommend replication. Again, master and secondary. We do not recommend clustering, a clustered MySQL, because it likely will not work. Once you switch over to the NDB data storage engine that clustered MySQL has, we'll run into problems. We actually feel our schema probably would not be applied well to using the NDB engine. So we say go with replication. As noted, you'll have automatic failover. So if your master goes down, secondary will take over. But one additional nice thing that we get with replication is when you're doing backups, go ahead and back up your secondary. A lot of times, well, when you do backups, right, tables are going to get locked. Large tables might be locked for a while. You could get some corruption. So do it with your secondary. Leave your master alone to do its thing with the JSS. Also, when talking about database engines, currently default is MyISAM. You can also use InnoDB. Primary difference between those two is MyISAM does table locking when doing anything to a table. InnoDB is row-level locking. Smaller environments, use the less complicated MyISAM. Everything should be perfectly fine. Larger environments, larger tables, you might want to move over to InnoDB just because of the performance you'd get with row locking versus table locking. Now, we'll move over from databases to network integration. And one of those places where we can do network integration is with Cisco's Identity Services Engine, or ICE. And really, what is that? Working in conjunction with the JSS, ICE can manage and determine what devices get what type of access on your network. Really, it's around compliance and following the security policies within for your corporation. So within ICE, you can set up the policies, and then in conjunction with the JSS, you can ensure that devices, first of all, are enrolled and that they're compliant. So with regard to enrollment, if I come into a place, I have my device, and it says, hey, wow, you don't exist in the JSS. Based on information that ICE has received from the JSS, ICE can go ahead and kick you over to enrollment, get you enrolled, get your config policies or profiles installed on your device. Then it can check you for compliance. Good examples of things around compliance. Hey, is your device disk encrypted? Has it been jailbroken? What's the OS and what version? And then based on those rules that you can have, you can determine what kind of access they get to your network. Maybe you'll just say, all right, this is no good, so we'll deny you access. Or you could get limited access, or even a splash page to say, hey, you need to fix this, that type of thing. All of that is configurable within ICE. Okay, and within the network integration section within JSS, this is where you can set up the piece that JSS does. Like I said, there's going to be a configuration portion in ICE to set up the compliance things that you want to have for devices. And then that kind of that hook between the JSS and ISE is to go ahead and match it up with an advanced search for mobile devices and computers. And this is the place where you can go ahead and set that. So now, based on the population of devices that you want controlled, you can do that setting right here. Oh, and I should call out, for those who want a lot more detail on ICE, tomorrow at 2:45 at the Dowling Theater, there will be another session specifically speaking on ICE and the integration with the Casper Suite. So check it out. Now, something introduced a couple of releases ago, the Jamf Infrastructure Manager. Some of you may know it just as the LDAP proxy server because that was really the first thing that it came under the guise of. Really, the goal of the Infrastructure Manager is a managed container for components that live outside of the JSS. The goal, or really what the Jamf Infrastructure Manager does, is it allows us to administer components and actually handle the life cycle and determine the status of these components that we're going to be building within the Infrastructure Manager. I'll get into the LDAP proxy server in a moment and kind of give you a little more detail, and you'll get an understanding of how that works. But the Infrastructure Manager will actually be enrolled like any other device in the JSS. Once it's enrolled, you'll have that secure communication. And I should say, just like it really does get special dispensation because, yeah, it's a device, but hey, it's special. It's the Infrastructure Manager. So we treat it with a little more security around it and whatnot. So like I said, it's installed or enrolled in the JSS, and then it also handles the communication with the JSS. It handles the checking in with the JSS to get any kind of config changes or any updates that are needed or any communication that has to be done with the components within the Infrastructure Manager itself. And actually, this is where you'll find it, a new icon for the infrastructure manager. One thing to note, that won't show up unless you enroll at least one infrastructure manager. So if you go into JSS and you're looking around, you're thinking, well, Joel's lying to me. I'm not. You have to enroll one first. And here you can get a little more detail around what the infrastructure manager has. Last check-in time, some other information. Really, the key piece here is the config setting for how often to check in. Much like devices, you can set that here as well. Now, I'm going to go ahead and dig in a little more to the LDAP proxy server. Again, the first component that we built within the infrastructure manager. And I think it really kind of shows you one of the better reasons or one of the major reasons why we built the infrastructure manager. For items that live outside of the JSS, LDAP proxy server is a good example. What that gives us then is the ability to be more flexible in the network configurations that we have. Infrastructure manager, you can go ahead and install it on the same server you have a JSS on, or you can put it on dedicated hardware. In the instance of the LDAP proxy server, the problem we're trying to solve here was for our folks in the cloud. JSS is hosted in the cloud, who still wanted access to their LDAP on their internal network. So the LDAP proxy server can work as a proxy, place it in your DMZ, and then set up that communication between your JSS cloud instance to the LDAP proxy into your LDAP, another layer of security. One thing to note on that, if you're already using secure LDAP as your communication, we leave that alone. We'll just pass that communication along. If you're not using secure LDAP from your JSS, we'll create an encrypted tunnel so that at least from your JSS to the LDAP proxy on the external network, at least that'll be encrypted for that trip. And now that we have the LDAP proxy, you can see in the JSS we have the option to go ahead and click that, and you can enter in your proxy information along with your other LDAP information. And now something relatively new, another thing that we built with the infrastructure manager is the healthcare listener. It's really more of a niche product for our friends in the healthcare industry. It's a component that can listen for events that happen in healthcare systems. A good scenario for this would be, really, I guess the scenario we're kind of going after is, let's say you have device, in hospitals have device there for every bed or every room. Patient's going to use that, might have some of their health information on it and whatnot. Now they're being discharged or they're being moved. Well, you want to wipe that device right away because you don't want the next patient to see the previous person information. So the listener will be listening for these events and then we'll act upon it with the JSS by sending a message to the JSS to say, hey, this bed or this room, this patient was discharged. JSS will determine what device it is, and then they'll send the wipe to take care of it. So, and here you can go ahead and kind of see that'll be the new piece that'll be coming out soon. It's in beta right now, but along with that, you can actually do some mapping between certain device characteristics to maybe what's back in the healthcare system, so you can map appropriately between devices. I know for some of you, I should note that when we first rolled out a couple releases ago with the LDAP proxy server, the installer that we had, it was simply Ubuntu. Now we'll be coming out soon with Red Hat and Windows. So that'll be coming out shortly. They're in test right now. So yeah, that's kind of it on that stuff. Guess it's time for the fun part.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. We have a couple of questions here on Twitter. So the first one, are there any plans for providing Docker or AWS containers for deploying Jamf?
Not at the moment, no. probably saw by my look on my face that I'm like, no, can't, nothing at the moment. No, sorry.
Okay. And our next question, is there a way to allow a failover to a cloud distribution point such as AWS?
Currently not at the moment, not with CDS. I would say that JCDS is rather new, and we have, we're always looking for what is the next thing we want to do with it. And these are the types of things we want to hear about from our customers, so we know what's next that we want to do with it. Like we said with the JDS and JCDS, we'd like to make that the primary thing that our customers use, but we've fallen short. And that's why we want to hear from you, so that we can go ahead and make the improvements that you want to see. So.
Cool. I would just add to that I do believe that is a feature request on Jamf Nation already. So if that is something you would like to see, I encourage you to vote that up. That is all of the questions on Twitter. If nobody else has anything they would like to ask, we will close out this session. But I would encourage you to get in touch with these guys after the session if you do have any further questions. I think we're good. Thank you very much.